Okay, good morning, everyone. Glad to see y'all back this morning. Everybody hear me okay? Shake your head if you can. Okay, good, good. Um, Don Scholes, I'm going to talk this morning about public meetings. Um, there's a utility district, first utility district, Knox County, has a couple of special things today. Kena Hires, today is her birthday. A little bird told me. I won't sing happy birthday. Nick wanted me to sing happy birthday, Kena, so I won't do that, okay? And Bruce Giles, the manager, today is the anniversary of his becoming the manager at First Utility District, Knox County. A very black, dark day, I'm afraid. Anyway, so we're going to talk about public meetings, which basically means the Tennessee Open Meetings Act, which is more commonly known as the Sunshine Law. I talk about this every once in a while. It's been a while, but over the last couple of years, there have been legislation that has sort of changed a couple things for us that are probably important to know and think about. But literally every year in the legislature, there is one bill, sometimes four or five, that deal with public meeting requirements. Um, when those occur, there's always competing interest in those. On the one side, you have the governmental entities that, you know, yes, we're all for open meetings, but don't make it so burdensome on us. The flip side is the media, who is constantly pushing for openness, openness, openness. Any hint of trying to make things less open is met with lots of resistance by the media lobbies. So any Sunshine Law, Open Meetings Act, open records legislations is always pretty contentious. So, but literally almost every year, there's something that comes down. But over the last couple of years, they've been a little more substantive than they have in the past. So, you know, as I said, the Tennessee Open Meetings Act, called the Sunshine Law, is designed to make the business of government open and transparent. You know, all states have some, sunshine law. They are on a continuum. Some are really, really, really open. Some are a little more opaque. On the scale, Tennessee is way up here on the open level. Okay. Um, so as usual, why do we have to have open meetings? The Tennessee General Assembly, our legislature, actually says at the beginning of the Sunshine Law, the Tennessee General Assembly declares it to be the policy of this state that the formation of public policy and decisions is public business and shall not be conducted in secret. Okay. So it's right there at the very beginning of the Open Meetings Act. Sort of in following that, when there are legal issues that arise with the application of the Sunshine Law, the courts in Tennessee will point back to this language and basically say, if there is any ambiguity about how the Sunshine Law is to be applied, they are going to construe that law broadly, which means they are going to always lean toward openness based upon the statement of the General Assembly. So that's the foundation. Is it a good idea? Probably. The practicality sometimes can be difficult, but it's what it is. Okay. So usually I leave this to the last, but I decided this time to sort of talk about what happens when you violate, some provision of the Sunshine Law. So it's a pretty big stick. Okay. If you take action at a meeting that in some shape, form, or fashion doesn't comply with the Sunshine Law, either you didn't give proper notice or the public has been excluded in some shape, form, or fashion. The penalty is action is void and of no effect except acting actions affecting public debt, meaning you've made a decision about debt and third parties are already relying upon it. So action is void is a pretty good penalty for anything. And so what does that mean? What happens? You get lawyers arguing over violations of Sunshine Law. Why do they why are Sunshine Law violations so good for legal disputes? Well, when you think about it, usually when you are challenging something, when you file something in court, you're trying to prove in some shape, form, or fashion that the merits of the action of the local government is somehow wrong. It's not done properly. It's not in the public interest. That's usually an argument on the merits of whatever the local government has done. Well, guess what? If you can show a violation of the Sunshine Law, you don't even have to argue about the merits of what was done. You just show there's a Sunshine Law violation and the action's void. That's a really easy way to get rid of some action that a local government or some agency within the government, state agency as well. So not uncommon to always see if there's a hot dispute to see a potential Sunshine Law violation thrown in. Why? Because that issue can really be decided pretty easily. The notice was either there or it wasn't there. The public was either allowed in the meeting or they weren't. So, Sunshine Law violations lawyers love because they don't have to fight about the merits of what they're trying to defeat. If they can find a Sunshine Law violation, the action's void. Okay. So, how do you enforce, a Sunshine Law violation? You do have to file, a lawsuit, in the local chancery or circuit court and basically say, here's how the Sunshine Law was violated. One thing that came about this year that's important is historically when a Sunshine lawsuit was filed, each party was responsible for their own litigation cost and mainly attorney fees, meaning that even if you won, you were challenging the action of a local government, you still had to pay your own attorney fees. There was no ability to ask the court to pay your attorney fees as the person that was challenging the local government action. That's a real deterrent to filing a lawsuit because, you know, tip, unfortunately, when you have to hire an attorney, it costs money. So this year, for the first time, the legislature added a provision to the Sunshine Law that basically says that if in fact a Sunshine Law violation is found in a lawsuit, that the court has the ability to allow the recovery of the litigation expenses and the attorney fees, provided that the violation is willful. That's a pretty big change. Um, there's already in Tennessee, if you have a public records lawsuit, there's a similar statute that's been in effect for a while. Again, that basically says, winds up if you prevail, you're the person challenging, you can get your litigation costs and attorney fees recovered, provided the violation is willful. Now, willful is not defined, but willful has been interpreted by the courts of Tennessee on a few occasions over the last decade or so. And willful doesn't mean in bad faith. It doesn't mean that you're there trying to prevent the public from knowing something. Willful just means if you're aware of the obligation to have the open meeting and you don't have it, that's probably a willful violation. Okay. So sometimes willful means really bad intent on your part, bad faith. In the public record lawsuits that use this same language, the courts have said willful really just means disregarding an obligation or a duty that you know. Very difficult, for a local government or an agency of a local government to argue that they were not aware of the obligation to have an open meeting. So, our, it we'll have to find out how big of a change that is, but it certainly makes it easier to move forward with a sunshine law lawsuit if you know you have the potential to get your attorney fees recovered. Okay. That's the legal part, you know. Okay. There's a sunshine law violation and the action is void. But honestly, sometimes the legal problem is not as bad as the public relations problem. So, you know, if in fact there has been a violation of the Sunshine Law, guess who's going to jump on the violation? The local media, you know, blank agency has secret meeting, you know, discussions have been made outside the public's view. So, sometimes it's the opportunity for the local media to really make you look bad. Even worse now is social media. Okay. Social media, they don't care really about what has or has not occurred, but they love a soundbite. The soundbite is blank utility district met in secret. You know, two utility district commissioners were seen together, talking at a restaurant. Is that a violation? Probably not. But that doesn't matter for social media purposes when you have an ulterior motive. All right. So, you know, and then sometimes, you know, somebody's unhappy with you personally or with the utility itself. Again, it just provides fodder for any opponents of the utility to say, see, they're not doing what they're supposed to do. They're violating the Tennessee Sunshine Law. They're trying to keep things from us. Okay. So I go over those at the beginning because, sometimes the ins and outs of the Sunshine Law, which we're going to talk about, you know, some of you all know it, some of you are new and it may be news to you. But, the reality is sometimes the biggest problem is not did we violate the Sunshine Law and our action's going to be void? It's what people do with it. Okay. So, in and of itself, that's a reason to know, what you're supposed to do and what you can do. And, as with everything else, there's some gray areas where it's sort of hard to say, yep, here's the black line. Okay. And we'll talk about a couple of those. Okay. So, we're going to go over three important concepts with the Sunshine Law. Meeting of a government body, because that's the term the statute uses in talking about a public meeting subject to the Sunshine Law. Adequate notice. Okay. That's the other part. You have to have a meeting, you have to give notice of the meeting. And then the third concept is the public's ability to attend and now to participate in the meeting. So we're going to sort of talk about those three. And a couple of those have changed, in the last couple of years. So, meeting of a governing body. Okay. And that term governing body has now sort of, it's got a definition in it and it's changed just a little bit. So, what is a meeting under the Sunshine Law? The convening of the governing body of a public body. So, utility district, that's your board of commissioners. You know, county board of public utilities, it's your board. To make a decision or to deliberate toward a decision on any matter. Okay. An important concept in sunshine law cases is the deliberation toward a decision. So you can, just because you don't make a decision at a meeting does not mean that it's not subject to the sunshine law. When it comes right down to it, any kind of discussion about action you're going to take now or in the future is a deliberation. That deliberation is supposed to be held in public. Okay. Until 2023, the definition of a meeting also said, and that you have a quorum for the meeting. That language has now been removed from the Sunshine Law. And it's sort of should have been removed a while ago because of the way the courts have interpreted meeting. But now it doesn't require that you have a quorum to be the governing body of a public body. So its governing body is what we're going to talk about, right? This one, just within the last month, had a conversation with somebody about a subset of their board members doing something. And, she said, it's not a quorum. And I had to say, well, the problem is that got taken out of the statute in 2023. Can't rely upon that anymore. Okay. Probably couldn't rely upon it even before, but you definitely can't now. So, this is the definition of a governing body. And it's the meeting of a governing body that triggers the Sunshine Law. The members of a public body, which consist of two or more members with the authority to make decisions or make recommendations to a public body on policy or administration. Okay. A couple of important things in there. Two or more members, recommendation. That's why the quorum language got taken out. Okay. Because it wasn't consistent with the change in this definition. Okay. So, the members of a public body which consist of two or more members. That means it doesn't have to be everybody. If you have a 5-member board, you have a 7-member board, and two of you get together to talk about business, red flags should start going up. Is this a meeting under the Sunshine Law? So, if you have, whether it's a committee, whether it's whatever you call it, you know, when you create some subset of your board members to do something, then that may be the meeting of a governing body, even though it's not all 3 commissioners or all 5 commissioners. When the authority of that committee or the agency or the board, when it comes from action of the governing body. So if it's, the county commission that creates the Public Utilities Committee, that's the action of the governing body of the county. And the committee members have the authority to make decisions or make recommendations on policy or administration affecting the conduct of the business of the people in the governmental sector. That's a meeting under the Sunshine Law. Okay, that's pretty broad. So here's an example. This was an attorney general's opinion. It's been around for a while, but it deals with this concept. So Henry County has a small airport. So the Henry County Commission created the Henry County Airport Committee to make recommendations on matters related to the airport. So they were going to hire a new manager for the airport. So they let the airport committee they'd been created interview the candidates and make a recommendation to the county commission over who should we hire. So the committee met, it was a 2 or 3 members of the county commission, but some other non-elected officials that run it. And so they had a meeting, they did the interviews, and they talked among themselves about who's the best person to recommend to the county commission to hire for the position. Attorney generals concluded that's the meeting of a governing body under the Sunshine Law. Why? Well, it met these 2 tests. Okay. The Henry County Airport Committee was created by the Henry County Commission, so the authority and origin of that committee arose from local government legislative action, and they had the authority to make recommendations to the Henry County Commission on hiring the manager. Now, that that is a good attorney general's opinion, but that was back in 96. So this is not really new. What's new is that over the last couple of years, this concept was sort of put into the statute that wasn't quite as plain as it was. So walking away, you know, if you create a budget committee of 2 members and you meet and you don't give notice of that meeting, of that committee to the public, and you talk amongst yourselves about what to recommend to the entire utility district board, does that sound like a meeting of a governing body based upon what I've told you? You should be shaking your head yes. Okay. Is that done? Yes, it's done. Okay. But like everything else, unless somebody raises the issue, it's not a problem. But the moment you come under scrutiny, that's exactly the kind of thing that people are going to jump on. Okay. So if you do it, just know that potentially lurking under what you're doing could be a potential Sunshine Law violation. Again, the Sunshine Law is not about efficiency for you. Okay. The Sunshine Law is about making sure that all the actions that you take are open for the public. And in essence, you can't really avoid that by creating a committee that has the nuts and bolts of the discussions amongst themselves and then just come back and make a recommendation to the utility district board as a whole. That committee is a governing body under the Sunshine Law. Okay. Okay. Can emails between members of a governing board be a meeting? Do you think I'm going to say yes or no? Yes. Okay. Again, 30 years ago, this was a non-issue. Okay. However, you know, communications being what they are, um, can emails amongst governing board members be a meeting? The answer to that is yes. So this was a case that was been 2009. It's got some age on it, but this is what the court said. In several email exchanges, and this dealt with the Metro Nashville Council, Council members are clearly weighing arguments for and against the overlay. That's what the disputed issue was about. These exchanges, most copied all council members, mirror the type of debate and reciprocal attempts at persuasion that would be expected to take place at a council meeting in the presence of the public and the council as a whole. We must conclude these emails are electronic communication used to deliberate public business in circumvention of the spirit and requirements of the Open Meetings Act. Guess what? Once the court made that finding, the dispute was done because the action became void that they took. I'm going to talk about this case just a little bit, really, for the next slide because it deals with this too. Of course, the Metro Council is a large body. They have 40 members. And they sort of had a habit of, prior to their big meeting, they have another relatively big room sort of behind the council meeting that sometimes, you know, people would be in there and sometimes there would be information in there. So this case sort of revolved around an action by, there was a ordinance that was going to be passed that dealt with putting a historic overlay over a portion of Nashville that would sort of restrict changes that you could make to the housing because they were trying to preserve, the historic nature of the neighborhoods that were going to be covered by this overlay. And of course, what that meant was that if you wanted to change something, you had to submit your changes to the Metro Historical Commission. And originally, it was not very controversial until some property owners popped up and said, I don't want to be told what I can and can't do with my property. So it became very divisive. And so, as most, you had two different groups, those that were supportive of the historic overlay, those that were not. And so, what really occurred when the final vote came up from the ordinance was, prior to the meeting at which they were going to adopt the ordinance on third reading, there had been over the last few weeks these emails back and forth between council members. How are you going to vote? What are we going to do to try to defeat this? Or what are we going to do to try to get this passed? Which was what I talked about before, that those emails communications were really deliberations like you would have in the open meeting. And so there was a challenge based upon the emails was a meeting of the governing body. And the court agreed with that. Yep, you were deliberating amongst yourselves, just like you would if you were in the council chamber considering the ordinance. But there were a couple of other challenges that were also made. Before the full council met in this large back room, there were a number of council members that went back into that back room. And in that back room, there were some folks from the Metro Historic Commission. There were there was another group that had been there in support of the historic overlay. There was a bunch of petitions that they had there, and there was also some third party that had been involved. And so when they went back there, of course, they had conversations with those people. They were really trying to get information about the ordinance. So the person that also challenged that filed this lawsuit also claimed that that meeting before the big council meeting in the back room, that was also the meeting of a governing body. And there was certainly no notice given of the pre-meeting before the council meeting. So that was a second way that the lawsuit tried to challenge the action that the Metro Council took. So the question came up, okay, Was that a meeting? Okay. So this sort of brings up next topic, and that is, are there meetings of the governing body that are not subject to the Sunshine Law? The answer to that is yes. If the only thing that's happening is you are receiving information and you're not deliberating about the decision, then it's not a public meeting under the Sunshine Law. Okay. It's the deliberations which are the problem. Just getting information only is not a problem. And so, what the court did in that Johnston case with Metro is, they talked, they took depositions of the council members that were back there and the other people that were back there in that room. And they confirmed that it truly was just information, questions being asked by individual council members, but that there was no deliberations amongst those that went back there on their own because it was open to anybody. So, but just sort of confirmed, and I like to use the term information only meetings. I don't think that's a legal term per se, but you know, as long as there's no deliberations or discussions about what you're going to do, then that is not a meeting that's subject to the Sunshine Law, doesn't require public notice, doesn't require the public to attend. A caution, but you have to be careful about public perception. You know, in that case, there were lots of members of the public that were there. Okay. But, an information only meeting, not subject to the Sunshine Law. So, a couple other sort of what I call information meetings that are really just listed, that are listed in the statute. So, statute says a meeting does not include an on-site inspection of any project or program. So, somebody's coming in to describe something to you, or you go out to see a neighboring water treatment plant that's going to be similar to what your manager is asking you. You can go and look at that. You can ask questions. What can you not do? You can't start turning to each other and start talking about, do you think this is a good idea? This is a bad idea? You know, it's an information only meeting. So you can go, you can ask questions, just don't turn to each other and start talking about, is this a good, bad idea? That's deliberating toward a decision. By definition, that triggers a public meeting. And chance meetings of two or more governing board members. That's been in the statute a while. You see somebody else that's a board member and in public, you're just talking, not a public meeting, unless you start deliberating toward a decision. Okay. So here's here's what the legislature says. When I call informational meetings. No chance meetings, informal assemblages, or electronic communications shall be used to decide or deliberate public business in circumvention of the spirit or requirements of the Open Meetings Act. Okay, so that's a fancy way of saying informational meeting is okay as long as you don't start deliberating and talking about what you're going to do with the information that you may be getting at those meetings. Okay. Okay. Again, this past term of the legislature, there was sort of a change made to the definition of a governing body. And what that basically says that the governing body, um, yeah, that two types of meetings are now excluded as being included within a governing body. A meeting for the exchange of information and not deliberative, that's already true. All right, that's nothing new. And this one was in the context of members of the legislature meeting with local government officials. So if your state legislator or legislators come and meet with, you know, two or more of the members of the local government or the utility district county commission, and the only thing that's happening is the exchange meeting for exchange of information, and there's no deliberation, not a public meeting. That was already true. This second one was not, because what it provides for is that if one or more of the legislators that if they have a meeting with the local government in the area they represent and they can conduct a meeting to discuss state matters and it not be a public meeting under the Sunshine Law. Okay. I think that's a pretty big exception, meaning, okay, we have a issue with the state of Tennessee that we're dealing with. Okay. Normally, when the local government talks about that, whether it's a state grant or whatever it may be, action that TDEC has taken, that's an open meeting, okay, for you all. It's an open meeting if two of you meet and deliberate toward it. But you bring in your state legislator or state legislators and you couch that discussion for a state matter, guess what? It's now exempt from the Sunshine Law. I'm not really sure that, well, I am sure that was the intent. The idea was the legislators wanted to be able to talk sometimes to local officials about state things without notice having to be given for the meeting. And guess who passes the Sunshine Law? The legislature. Okay. Duh. So, this sort of just went through without a lot of, I'm sure there was some opposition, but I perceive this as a potential pretty big hole. Okay. Because all you got to do is you got to get one legislator there at your meeting and whatever you're talking about, if it's a state matter and it has no definition, it's state matter, it's exempt. Okay. Okay. So that's the governing body. So three concepts: governing body, of the local government has to the Sunshine Law. That's usually a big one. Okay, the biggest one when it comes to it. So, and that's changed just a little bit over the last couple of years. Okay, so second concept is notice of a meeting that's subject to the Sunshine Law, whether it's the budget example I gave you or you know, or the meeting of the utility district board as a whole or the utility board that you work for. Okay, so what is adequate notice? Okay, the legislation does not say what adequate notice is. Okay, there are no hard and fast rules on the timing of the public notice. How many days before the meeting does it have to be given? There's no hard and fast rule on where you have to give the public notice. Okay. There's really no, with one exception, there's no hard and fast rule on the content of the public notice, except if you are going to require advance notice for members of the public to comment at your board meeting, then your public notice of the meeting has to give the public how what they're supposed to do to be able to to give comments at the meeting. This was new as of 2023. Okay. You may have heard me talk about that last year. So, but there's no hard and fast rules on how long before the meeting the notice has to be given, where the notice has to be provided. So, which means the courts are the ones that wind up interpreting that. Okay. But here's what the courts say. We think it's impossible to formulate a general rule in regard to what the phrase adequate public notice means. However, adequate public notice means adequate notice under the circumstances or such notice based on the totality of the circumstances as would fairly inform the public. Very helpful, right? Very helpful. About as helpful as this one. The circumstances of each case must be taken into account in order to determine the adequacy of the notice given. Again, very helpful. So, how often do I get a question? We're having a special meeting, or a question's come up about how much notice we have to give. How much notice we have to give? The lawyer in me goes, you have to give adequate notice. If there's not a specific number of days before the meeting or where you have to give the notice. Okay. So more helpful language from the courts. As to timing, must be posted at a time sufficiently in advance of the actual meeting in order to give citizens both the opportunity to become aware of and to attend the meeting. Location, must be posted in a location where a member of the community could become aware of such notice. Again, you want something concrete. You don't want this abstract crap, but that's what we have. Okay. So when someone calls me, here's what I tell people. I say, Sunshine Law requires, quote, adequate public notice, but does not say what that is. Even though we're where we are in today's society and technology, if you want to make sure you don't have a problem, give notice in the public, give notice in a local newspaper at least 7 days before the meeting, and you will never have a problem. Now, you all, especially utility districts that live in rural areas, go, we have to know that 3 weeks in advance. We don't have a local paper anymore. Or even if you do, you've got to get the notice in at least a week before you want it published, which means, you got to be 2.5 weeks ahead of the curve. All right. So, and I will say in today's society, it seems like newspaper notice is sort of why? I mean, if somebody wants to know about a public meeting, are they truly going to look in the newspaper for that notice? The answer to that is no. Okay. But, you know, attempts, go ahead. Okay. So, question, what if you put it on your bill every month? Yeah. So, this statute doesn't say newspaper. There may be some other public notice requirements that say newspaper, but the Public Meetings Act doesn't require it. So, you know, but again, it doesn't have to be in the newspaper, okay? But you're going to have to give notice that meets sort of this requirement. Yeah, right. You know, you know, from a practical standpoint, if you give notice on your website, if you put notice up in the office of the utility, and utility districts are required to have the notice of the regular meetings on their bills. You do that 7 days beforehand, you're going to be okay. Okay. Because the question is, it has to be in a location where a member of the community could become aware of the notice. In all likelihood, the people that are interested in what you're doing as the utility are your customers. Now, your customers sometimes is the entire public, but not necessarily. Okay. It doesn't, which is why the requirement that's been a requirement for a long time that if you're a utility district, you put your regular meeting supposed to be on the bill. That goes to your customers. I've always been uncomfortable with relying upon that as public notice because your customers is not necessarily everybody. Okay. That's going to receive that. So that's a separate requirement. That's not a sunshine law requirement. Yeah. So again, Facebook page. Okay. It makes perfect sense for the legislature to say publication on the website is sufficient when it comes to location. There was a bill last year that really said that, but it got quashed because the media lobbyist didn't like it. Okay. It doesn't mean that you can't use the website, for your public notice, but we were a proponent to sort of say, yes, we like this. Let's let this go through, but it was connected to something, the bill was connected to something else. So, you know, can you give notice? All of a sudden you realize you need to do something. You need to have a board meeting. Is putting it on your website in the office, you know, and, you know, if you're in a community where you have a local post office 3 days beforehand, sufficient? It probably is. But you're asking me that question. I'm going to give you I'm going to say, I can't tell you for sure. It sounds like it to me. But, ultimately, you're not going to know until the court tells you what it is. Now, again, most of you all rarely have issues when it comes to, people challenging, what you do based upon, uh, violation of the Sunshine Law. But again, the problem typically is not somebody trying to invalidate what you did at your meeting. It's the bad publicity and the fodder that it gives when somebody has something to. Okay, so in 2023, there was a bill that was enacted that basically provides that if you are a city, county, metro government, you now are required to publish your agenda of a meeting in a place that's available to the public, which can be the website, at least 48 hours before the meeting. Okay. When that, a plug for TAUD at the moment, when that bill came about, we sort of started going, don't make us do that. This is designed for, you know, larger entities. And so we and had some other people come along were able to sort of get ourselves exempted out of this publishing the agenda 48 hours beforehand. So if you're still hearing that, it's true for the governing body of a city or a county or metro government, but it's not true for utility districts. It's not true for the county board of public utilities. It's not true for your utility board. Okay. Um, so, you know, at the moment, you don't really have to change what you're doing when it comes to one of your regular meetings and you've decided not to require advance notice of someone that wants to make a comment at your meeting. It's up to you whether you want to require advance notice to a member of the public to make comments at your meeting. If you choose to do that, then you got to put in your public notice how they are to do that. Do they have to contact you a week beforehand in order to be able to make a comment at the meeting? Okay. That one is still lurking out there. So generally, if you have a regular meeting, I mean, you're still not required to put items in the agenda. Put the agenda or in your notice, say what it is you're going to act on. Because the statute speaks to the notice of the meeting only. It does not speak to the notice of the content of the meeting. That's no longer true. That's a quote from a Tennessee Supreme Court case. That's no longer true for cities and counties and metro government meetings because now they have to give 48 hours notice of the agenda and it's got to be in a public place. But for you all, that's still true. Okay. Okay. Now, every once in a while, if you've got a if you're getting a rural development loan, a third party may want you to do that. If you get a rural development loan, they want you to publish in the newspaper, that you're having a meeting and you're going to be adopting this bond resolution at your meeting. But that's the requirement of a third party. It's not a requirement of the Sunshine Law. I got to get moving. Okay, I'm going to go real fast. So, Sunshine Law looks at two kinds of meetings: regular meeting, your regular monthly board meeting, and a special meeting. Okay. So, a regular meeting is a meeting that is set forth by statute, ordinance, resolution, or by law. Okay. If it's not established by one of those, an argument could be made it's a special meeting. You all have regular, if you're utility districts, you all have regular board meetings every month. But if you don't have that in a bylaw, or you can't point back to something where you've stated that, it just raises an uncertainty. If I were you, I would go back, and if you don't have a bylaw that says our meeting is the third Tuesday of every, regularly third Tuesday of every month, just adopt in a bylaw or just take action at a board meeting to make it clear what your regular meetings are, because this is what it requires to have a regular meeting. All right. So does the agenda or subject of a special meeting have to be in the notice? We just got through talking about that you don't have to have your agenda at a regular board meeting, but if you have a special meeting, something other than for you all, it's mainly your other meeting, then you do have to say what the purpose of the special meeting is for. So the contents of the notice must reasonably describe the purpose of the meeting or the action to be taken. You all probably don't have a lot of special meetings, but if you do, your public notice is going to have to say what it is you're going to do. Okay. So real quickly, this was a case where there was a special meeting and there was a Sunshine Law uh, claim that was made that the Sunshine Law was violated. Inglewood Citizens for alternate B versus the town of Inglewood. It was really a challenge to a new location for a highway that was going to go through in or around Inglewood, which is a little town in East Tennessee. Now, who won this? Who won this law? Who got the city council to do what they wanted to do? The Citizens for alternate A won. Okay, because the Citizens for alternate B are the ones filing the lawsuit. So the question came up: was the notice for the special meeting, did it meet the Sunshine Law requirements? So the content of the public notice said, we're having a public meeting and the purpose of this meeting is to do a letter to the state concerning Highway 411. Court found that was insufficient to describe the purpose of the meeting. The purpose of the meeting was to determine what location Highway 411 was going to go, this way or that way. So the court said insufficient. Now, where was the notice published? City Hall, the post office, and the Valley Bank. Okay. They thought location wise that was sufficient. All right. How many days before the meeting? 2 days. Court said not sufficient. Would 5 days been sufficient? Probably. I don't know. But that's a good example of when you're doing when you have a Sunshine Law violation, these are the three things. These are the things the court's going to look at if it's a special meeting. Location, special meeting. What do you have in there? Okay. Gotta keep moving. All right. Finally, public attendance and participation. Okay. Beginning July 1st of last year, the governing boards of local governments must reserve a time for public comments on matters which are germane to items on the agenda of the board meeting, and must take steps to make sure that all opposing viewpoints are heard. This was new. Now, for most of you all, most of you all have a public comment period for your meetings. You may not have anybody that shows up, but if you do, you generally will let them speak, which is a good idea. But before this was passed, I mean, you're not really, you know, you're not really required to let the public speak at a meeting that they attend. The Sunshine Law requires that you give notice of the meeting and that the public be able to attend the meeting, not necessarily that they participate in the meeting. This sort of changed the participation. So, um, if you allow, if for the local comment, the comment period, you can require that a member of the public that wants to offer comments to give advance notice that I'm coming to the meeting and I want to make comments. Not required to do that. If you're a small utility, I wouldn't do it. It's a pain, it's a pain to do that because you're going to have to start putting that out in every public meeting notice. But you can place reasonable restrictions on the comment, length period, number of speakers, length of time each speaker may comment. Again, makes sense for larger governmental bodies, county commissions, city councils, especially the larger cities. Utility districts, not so much. So now there is a right of members of the public to make comments on matters that are on the agenda if they attend the meeting. It's up to you whether you want to require that they give you advance notice that they do. But if you require advance notice, that's supposed to be in your public notice of every meeting that you give. Okay, so outside of this public comment period, no statutory right for citizens to speak or to participate. They can be there. So remember, the public's there. You have your public comment period. After that, if somebody wants to make a big deal and speak, you can shut them down. You don't have a right to participate other than at the public comment period. Okay. It may not be a good idea to do so, but you don't have to do it. And I'm really running out of time. Okay. I mean, real quick about executive sessions. Okay. There are only two times when the governing board of a public body can say, we're going to have an executive session and exclude the public. I don't care what you've heard from anybody else, including Mr. Newman yesterday. Okay. Two exceptions to having an executive session to exclude the members of the public. One, you are meeting with your attorney about pending or threatened litigation. All right. Number one, even if you meet with your attorney when you were just getting information, you are not supposed to turn to each other and say, okay, what are we going to do? Are we going to settle? Do we settle for 50,000, 150,000? Deliberations and decisions must still be made in the public meeting. Okay. It's an opportunity to preserve the attorney-client privilege to talk to your attorney outside the public. But when it comes to what you're going to do, you're supposed to go back into the public meeting. The second is, if you have created a local government audit committee, how many people in here have created a local government audit committee? Do I see any hands? No. Okay. Which means exception number 2 does not apply to you, no matter what you have heard. Okay. But typically, larger counties, larger cities have a local government audit committee. They can have an executive session to discuss these items and also to discuss those with the governing body. Confidential public record requests, litigation, audit and fraud investigations, information protected by federal law, reports of illegal fraudulent activity. But again, you exclude everybody when the local government audit committee's talking to the county commission or the city council. But when it comes to what they're going to do, that has to be in the open meeting. I'm telling you, if anybody else tells you separate and you've heard something different, I'm sure it's not true. Just try it and let it be controversial, and let somebody file a lawsuit and you'll find out. Okay. This is a public notice of a work session of the Alcoholic Beverage Board of City of Mount Juliet. They've done it right. They're having a work session. They're going to talk about business. That's a deliberation. They need to give notice. The fact that you're not going to make a decision does not make it a non-public meeting. If you're going to deliberate toward a decision, that's a public meeting subject to the Sunshine Law. Now, it's fine to say, we're having a work session. We're not going to make any decisions. And if that means the members of the public don't want to come, fine. But you still got to give public notice of it. Okay. Okay. I'm going to talk about this and I'm going to stop. Utility districts, any, um, there's really no local governments that can now have meetings in which board members can participate electronically. When the pandemic was in effect, the governor issued an executive order, and the governor in an emergency situation has the ability to suspend state statutes or state rules. The governor suspended for a year plus the Sunshine Law requirements for for all meetings. Okay. But once that um, executive order ended, which was probably in late 21, it could have been early 22, everything went back to the way that was before. So electronically, board members of state agencies and commissions, they can meet electronically if they do certain items. Emergency communication district boards of directors can as well. Why? Because the legislature says they can. You all can't. Okay. There was a period of time where it was open. I still had a call last week. Can a commissioner attend electronically? The answer to that is no. So now, if you want to call in and participate and listen to what's going on, you can do that. But you can't be counted to a quorum, you can't vote, and you certainly can't get your per diem for attending the meeting. So I'm gonna stop there because I've run out of time. So anyway, if you have a question, come up afterwards and talk to me. I've sort of gone past my time. Thank you all. Take about 10 minutes. Well, I'm here to answer your questions, Vina, as always.